So today we're going to do something a little different. Even though I usually only make videos about games and occasionally about far too personal stories insofar as they relate to games, I actually like other things, like Italian ice and pizza and gangster movies. And even some non-Italian things like A Song of Ice and Fire, though even that is better with Italian ice. The good stuff, not this garbage. If it isn't handed to me by a guy in a wife beater with a gold Italian horn necklace nestled in his chest fur, it is not Italian ice. Anyway, ever since I was young, I have been a reader. Growing up, Kurt Vonnegut's novels changed my life when I was 13 and miserable. And as a miserable teenager, Orwell and Asimov and Herbert all were incredibly important to me. As I became a miserable adult, I started reading literary fiction like Raymond Carver and Hemingway, Shakespeare, Breese Pancake, Larry Brown. And in my happier, though still curmudgeonly middle years, I basically read histories and biographies. Thucydides and Churchill, Lincoln and Napoleon. In the last decade or so, I have read very little fiction outside of one series of books so important to my wife and I that we ended up going to our first fan conventions to sit in panels, discuss the books, and show off my beard. That series is, of course, A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. This isn't all that common, but it's noteworthy for me because even though I read a decent amount of sci-fi when I was young, I've never been all that into genre fiction or pop culture stuff. I don't care about Marvel, I haven't read a Star Wars Expanded Universe novel, and most importantly, I never got into fantasy. The aesthetic never resonated with me and the stories always ended up seeming too simple. Even as a young person reading The Lord of the Rings, I ended up thinking about things like, what do the orcs want? Are they all going to become farmers afterward? What's Sauron's actual motive here? Do the orcs have restaurants? How do they get paid? Shit like that. But A Song of Ice and Fire was different than all the other fantasy books I'd read or tried to read. Its heroes were complex, its villains logical and understandable. The series is so good, it's the very rare example of genre fiction as literature. It's on par with the very best work from people like Orwell, Margaret Atwood, Vonnegut, or Philip K. Dick. And the series is a titanic artistic achievement that boggles the mind in its breadth and scope. Having said that, and being a dude who also quite likes cinema, I have always understood the limits of adaptation. There are very few movies or shows better than the source work. Jaws, basically. So my expectations for the show were never absolute fidelity to the books. Still, over the years as I've heard people, including Martin himself, say, the show is the show and the books are the books, I've always found that argument particularly flimsy, because there's an easy response to it, and that's this. The show owes all of its success to those books. They paid money to exclusively license the story because the books are a story worth telling, and the show bears at least some responsibility to preserving the themes and tone of the original, if not all of the detail and plot points. And this can be done. The Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings movies managed to change quite a lot while remaining a crowning example of successful cinematic adaptation. Details change, scenes are added or subtracted, but the movies remain remarkably true to the arcs of the characters and the most important plot developments. All of the characters start and end in the right place because Jackson was incredibly careful in his adaptation for that series. The Hobbit blows, but you can't win them all. Today, we're going to do part 1 in a series of indeterminate length about the show A Game of Thrones and why it ultimately ended up making Mass Effect 3 and Lost look like perfect endings. In this first part, I'm just going to lay out some groundwork by looking at a few of the changes the show made early on and what the reasoning behind them says about the writer's intentions or lack thereof. In the next part, I'll take a look at how changes to characters both small and large add up over time until they fundamentally alter the original intent of the source material. Then we will do the same for plot developments. We'll examine a kind of artistic game of telephone where small details spread through the telling to totally change the original message. And finally, we'll end with a conclusion that will try and show that the final season was actually doomed as early as season 5, because there had come a point when all of these small changes had added up to create something that could never be satisfactorily wrapped up in just 3 short seasons. But today is just an introduction to the goals of an adaptation and how small changes can have big effects. We'll look at the different kinds of changes the show has made, from inconsequential to neutral to good to bad, and we'll examine those changes by looking at just a few scenes from the first episode of the show, because as good as that first season of A Game of Thrones was, these issues were present right from the start. An adaptation is not a full retelling, and changes were always going to be made, but only by examining the process behind those changes can we understand where things went wrong. And to get this out of the way early, I'm not making any value judgments or even trying to push my opinion. If you love the show, that is perfectly defensible. I like Morrissey and folk music and calamari. There's no accounting for taste. I'm simply going to lay out objective facts about the changes that were made in the first episodes and their ultimate effect upon the source material. After the logo. I've already said that fantasy fiction had never been on my radar. Like millions of people, I'm sure, I began watching A Game of Thrones because its marketing was excellent, and I was already prone to giving HBO shows a chance. The Sopranos and The Wire are some of the best television ever made, and my wife and I decided to give the show a shot. After that first season was over, we immediately read all the books before season 2 aired, which almost certainly doomed us to disappointment with the show. The books are absurdly dense tomes, and the show's insistence on less than 10 hours a season meant heavy abridging would be necessary. The audiobooks of these novels are like 40 hours each, people. One of the most amazing things about Martin's books is how much his voice has changed over time. When I recommend the book to others, I always tell them the first book is very much a genre fantasy novel, with the early chapters especially being kinda cheesy at times. With each book after A Game of Thrones, Martin has gotten better, more detailed, more evocative. I can't think of any other writer who so effectively found a master's voice so late in life. This set the show up for a difficult task from the beginning. Book 1, A Game of Thrones, is easy to imagine adapted to the screen. It relies heavily on a relatively small set of characters interacting with large plot points. It is tight and focused. By Book 4, the narrative has expanded, and internal conflicts with weighty themes have replaced shocking plot moments for much of the book's narrative force. By A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, some of the book's best moments are centered around defaulting on loans, or a character aimlessly wandering a castle with his regrets. The vast majority of these last two books are at their best when we are seeing characters thinking rather than doing. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's take a look at a few very early changes and see why the first season was so successful despite them. Change for the sake of. Rewatching the first season of Game of Thrones after having read the books is an interesting thing. Season 1 is full of changes to the books. It has new scenes, new characters, and a slightly different pacing for the plot, but it also does a quite admirable job realizing what is absolutely essential. All of the book's major plot points are hit, and the vast majority of characters enter the story as they do in the book and begin their arcs in the same place. And yet, there are still changes that needed to be made and changes that didn't need to be made. Let's start from the top. Tellingly, the very first scene of the show is both well done and a bit troubling. Why is it well done? Because the tone and major plot points are all faithfully recreated. It is very well shot, as always, very well acted, as always, and the characters themselves are all true to their book counterparts. The show does an amazing job of making clear, visually, what Martin takes pages to exposit. The three characters we meet in the show, as in the book, are Garrett, Will, and Waymar Royce. Martin spends pages explaining these men as a way to introduce us to the world of Westeros. Will, the chapter's point of view character, is a young tracker of common birth. He is skilled and brave, yet condemned to live on the wall for life because he was caught poaching a deer on his lord's property. Garrett is Will in 25 years. Tough, brusque, hard-bitten. He knows what he's doing, and in a different society would be the one in command because he has survived up here for decades. Though they are all supposedly in a meritocratic martial brotherhood, they're being led by the young, arrogant, inexperienced son of a great lord. Sir Waymar is a Royce of Runestone, one of Westeros' oldest and most powerful great houses. Waymar is young and rich, he's haughty and arrogant. He doesn't respect the fact that these two men know better than he does. How could he believe that? He was brought up in a castle, in a world where who your father is confers incalculable advantages. Waymar was born to lead. Will and Garrett were born to obey. Martin's first chapter pulls us in with suspense and horror, while also setting up the feudal structure and class conflict of Westeros in a few tightly constructed scenes. The show manages to impart nearly all of this layered background in just a few moments with costume design, good casting, excellent direction, and well-written dialogue that's taken almost directly from the book, but improved by being pared down some and modernized. This opening scene is a nearly flawless example of adaptation for the most part. It identifies every important point of the source material and distills it down into something visually entertaining and concise. And its greatest achievement is it manages to do exactly what the first chapter of the book does: make the reader want to know more. It is a testament to the quality of the show early on that the class dynamics of Westeros are pretty clear in this first scene, even without a character's internal dialogue to explain it to us. That is what a good adaptation does. It takes writing and communicates it in a visual medium. Now for the changes. None of the changes the show makes to the second part of this scene will seem immensely important when we first look at them. They're the kind of thing that might seem like fanboy nitpicking, but indulge me because they're more important than it would seem. It would be easy to think, if none of these changes matter to the overall plot of the story, then they don't matter. But they actually do, because they demonstrate the first instance of something that will become disastrous over the years. A couple of changes made for seemingly no purpose, and a change that seems small and is justifiable, but if indicative of a lack of respect for the book's themes, will ultimately lead to real problems. First, the ones for no purpose. In the books, it is Will with Royce when the White Walkers reveal themselves, and Garrett who runs and gets away. This is a change that doesn't seem to matter very much in the grand scheme of things. It's only actual consequences that in the book everyone is more uncomfortable because Garrett has been on the wall for 30 years, and the idea of him deserting lends more credence to his talk of the White Walkers. In the book, Lord Commander Mormont specifically talks about his uneasiness with the situation precisely because the older, more seasoned man deserted. But to be totally fair, this is a very small, ultimately not very important change. But if that's the case, why was it made? With books as universally praised and so carefully plotted as A Song of Ice and Fire, one would think that all changes should be handled carefully and only with good reason. Many of the changes I'll address in this series are not inherently bad, but I'm as concerned with the process involved in making the change as I am the changes themselves. What is the reason for this change? I can only even think of 3, and all of them are varying shades of troubling. One is that the showrunners believed we'd feel worse about the younger, better-looking man being executed. Another is that they thought the guy who played Will was the stronger actor, and the final, more likely possibility is that right from the start, they wanted to put their own spin on the show and change things so it felt more like their work than Martin's. So, change for change's sake. None of these are good reasons to change something. The first demonstrates an attitude that will become increasingly clear over time, a disrespect for the intelligence of the audience. The second is the least disturbing, but would still at best demonstrate a poor casting process. The third is catastrophic, because it introduces personal ego as an important factor. No one can argue that this is an important artistic decision by the show to have Will beheaded instead of Garrett. In fact, when we look at the books, we can see that Martin chooses Garrett to be the one killed by Ned because Martin wants to use his decades of experience with the Watch as a way to really drive home how strange it was that he had fled. There's a clear purpose in Martin's decision-making here. It's obvious that when he decided who fled and who died, it was a considered choice. The show's decision lacks this. The change doesn't serve the story or the plot. At very best, it is a neutral change that does not matter. But if a change doesn't matter, why make a change at all? After reading the books and watching season 1 again all those years ago, this change has always stuck out to me because unlike many of the others we'll look at in this episode and in the future episodes, this one has no logical purpose. And again, I think any change should only ever be made for a purpose. A change for no purpose is as disturbing as a change made for a mistaken purpose because it demonstrates either a lack of care or an unearned arrogance. Let's get to the second, far more consequential change to this scene. In the books, Waymar Royce actually fights the White Walkers. This was changed to him being quickly murdered from behind like a chump. Now, this particular scene in the books isn't written all that well, frankly. It's a bit clumsy and reads like genre fiction. It's one of the very best examples one can cite to demonstrate the improvements that Martin has made as a writer. If this scene was in A Dance with Dragons, it would not read the same. Here, I will actually read it so you understand what I'm talking about. If you've read the books, you will notice the voice of this section is far more Tolkien than Martin. Here we go. A shadow emerged from the dark of the wood. It stood in front of Royce. Tall it was, and gaunt, and hard as old bones, with flesh pale as milk. Its armor seemed to change color as it moved. Here it was white as new-fallen snow, there black as shadow. Everywhere, dappled with the deep gray-green of the trees. The patterns ran like moonlight on water with every step it took. Will heard the breath go out of Sir Waymar Royce in a long hiss. "Come no farther," the lordling warned. His voice cracked like a boy's. He threw the long sable cloak back over his shoulders to free his arms for battle and took his sword in both hands. The wind had stopped. It was very cold. The other slid forward on silent feet. In its hand was a long sword like none that Will had ever seen. No human metal had gone into the forging of that blade. It was alive with moonlight, translucent, a shard of crystal so thin it seemed almost to vanish when seen edge on. There was a faint blue shimmer to the thing, a ghost light that played around its edges, and somehow Will knew it was sharper than any razor. Sir Waymar met him bravely. "Dance with me, then." He lifted his sword high over his head, defiant. His hands trembled from the weight of it, or perhaps from the cold. Yet in that moment, Will thought he was a boy no longer, but a man of the Night's Watch. The other halted. Will saw its eyes, blue, deeper and bluer than any human eyes, a blue that burned like ice. They fixed on the long sword, trembling on high, watched the moonlight running cold along the metal. For a heartbeat, Will dared to hope. They emerged silently from the shadows, twins to the first. 3 of them, 4, 5. Sir Waymar may have felt the cold that came with them, but he never saw them, never heard them. Will had to call out. It was his duty, and his death if he did. He shivered and hugged the tree and kept his silence. The pale sword came shivering through the air. Sir Waymar met it with steel. When the blades met, there was no ring of metal on metal, only a high, thin sound at the edge of hearing, like an animal screaming in pain. Royce checked a second blow, and a third, then fell back a step. Another flurry of blows, and he fell back again. Behind him, to right, to left, all around him, the watchers stood, patient, faceless, silent, the shifting patterns of their delicate armor making them all but invisible in the wood. Yet they made no move to interfere. Again and again the swords met, until Will wanted to cover his ears against the strange, anguished keening of their clash. Sir Waymar was panting from the effort now, his breath steaming in the moonlight. His blade was white with frost. The others danced with pale blue light. Then Royce's parry came a beat too late. The pale sword bit through the ringmail beneath his arm. The young lord cried out in pain. Blood welled between the rings. It steamed in the cold, and the droplets seemed red as fire where they touched the snow. Sir Waymar's fingers brushed his side. His moleskin glove came away soaked with red. The other said something in a language that Will did not know. His voice was like the cracking of ice on a winter lake, and the words were mocking. Sir Waymar Royce found his fury. "For Robert!" he shouted, and he came up snarling, lifting the frost-covered longsword with both hands and swinging it around in a flat sidearm slash with all his weight behind it. The other's parry was almost lazy. So I think it's clear that while that's a well-written passage, it's also dripping in some fantasy cliches. It feels like what it is, a fantasy novel. The show has a different feel from the start, and I can understand wanting to strike a horror tone for the White Walkers. We don't necessarily need the heroic fight of Waymar Royce. But there's something very important lost here right from the beginning that will end up nearly dooming the show in its final season, and it has nothing to do with Waymar at all. It's that the book literally characterizes the White Walkers more in this small passage than the show does in 8 years. From the very beginning of the book, it is made explicitly and obviously clear that the White Walkers are not monsters. They are not zombies. They are a different species of people. They have a culture. They have technology, armor, swords, and language. More than that, the White Walkers aren't just talking, they are laughing. They're mocking Royce. Their goal isn't seemingly to just kill all humans. They seem dismissive and arrogant. They toy with him and mock him and laugh at him before he dies. This not only serves to characterize the others, it's the very first sign that this story will be about the fact that petty class disputes are ultimately meaningless when the White Walkers come. These men die not just because the Walkers killed them, they die because Royce is an arrogant lord's son who won't listen to reason. The class dynamics of Westeros kill these men as much as the sword of the others. The book White Walkers have motive and character. We don't know what that motive is, and we don't understand their full culture or character yet, but it's clear they are not monsters. Martin has always described the White Walkers, both in person and in the books, as beautiful, graceful, majestic even. They're frightening but also strangely impressive. They are others. That's a purposeful word to choose. These few lines make it clear, again, this is a different species of person. They want things. They have a sense of humor. They talk to each other. They enjoy this. Now, let's real quick examine the show's White Walkers, starting with that scene where they kill Royce like the chump he is.
What is it?
I'll give the show credit for what it does best: badass epicness. The pacing of Royce's death and the editing is evocative and arresting, and the immediate cut to the chase in the woods is excellent cinema. The show has other excellent badass other moments as well. When the Night King raises the dead with Jon watching, that is undoubtedly badass TV. It is menacing and awesome. But by changing this part of the opening scene, the show misses one of its most important opportunities to communicate something about the White Walkers. It trades context and character for a badass horror. Could they have had both? Maybe. Or maybe not. I'm not saying this change is good or bad. You can make up your own mind. What I'm trying to get at is, seemingly small changes like this can end up having far-reaching implications. When we miss this first opportunity at characterizing the others, it says something about artistic intent. In retrospect, is it so hard to believe that we don't ever really learn anything about them? What do they want? Why now? Where do they live? It's my problem with the orcs all over again. After killing all the humans, are the others going to settle down in castles and have zombie farms? Do they just go to sleep? Who's making their armor? Will they all hang out and commission plays commemorating their victory? I don't know, because the show never got to that. These things seem like little nitpicks, but they are not. They're fundamental issues. It is impossible to create art if these kinds of questions aren't answered. If Martin fails to answer these questions, he will have failed. Psst, he will answer these questions. If you leave these questions in the mind of a viewer or a reader, you haven't made cinema or literature, you have made a genre piece. Now, there's no denying that that scene is extremely well done, but this is a change that matters, and years of these changes start to add up. And that's not to say that genre pieces cannot be great. Alien is an amazing genre piece. The Lord of the Rings might very well be the greatest genre piece of all time. Star Wars is a textbook genre piece, but the very things that separates A Song of Ice and Fire is it uses its genre setting to tell a literary story, to create a work of art. It's the difference between The Shining and Friday the 13th, or 1984 and Star Wars. So why would the show make this change? Why would they decide to remove the others talking? I think here we can say that the change was made for a legitimate purpose, an effort to adapt this scene to the screen and focus more on the emotion of the viewer than on characterizing the others. This could have been an effective example of adaptation if the show had remembered that it missed this opportunity and replaced it somewhere else, but it didn't. Okay, that is literally the first scene, and we've got a long way to go. Yeah, this is getting long already. Shit. Anywho, let's move on. From here on in, the first episode of A Game of Thrones is going to remain very true to its source material. For the most part, making changes that are all neutral or needed, trimming unnecessary parts, doing cuts for better pacing, etc. The next major change we will get to is the introduction of Tyrion and Roz. In the books, we are not introduced to Tyrion in a brothel. He makes a fairly weak introduction in the books when he literally does a cartwheel off of a wall in front of Jon at the feast to welcome King Robert. This is one of the first book's most cringy moments for me, and one that Martin himself has admitted is kinda shite. Anyway, the introduction of Tyrion is an example of a very good change to the books. We're instead introduced to him in a brothel. This works on many levels for the show and is an example of a positive piece of cinematic adaptation. Tyrion, at the start of the series, is a man utterly without purpose. He's ugly, hated, and rich. He has no job, no lands, no love. His is a life full of privilege, but bereft of meaning. His story is one of a man going from unneeded and resented to powerful and rising, because in a time of war, all that matters is competence. It's why we started letting ladies work in World War II. We needed them to put together planes and shit. Choosing to introduce Tyrion in a brothel works for the character. It arguably works better than Martin's own introduction. And there are a couple of other reasons this change works for the show, and clearly was made thoughtfully and with a plan. First, because an HBO show needs to have edgy sex. Fine. I'm not so pure as to dismiss the need to make the show adult. Martin's books are often described as being racy or having a lot of sex, though this isn't actually all that true. The books do have sex scenes, but they are almost all used as ways to more deeply examine a character. They are intimate moments that serve to explain who someone is, where they are, and what they want. They generally are not this, for instance. The show needs tits and ass. I understand this, even though I think it's stupid. They make porn for this. If I want tits and ass, I can watch porn. Anyway. The Roz scene accomplishes the goal of introducing Tyrion in an intimate and illuminating moment. It works. It also works because it produces something the show needs, which is racy sex. And finally, it works because while the books do a good job of making the reader painfully aware that Westeros is populated by normal people who are devastated by the games and ambitions of the Great Lords, it doesn't actually feature any specific peasant as an important character until Arya's time with Hot Pie, Lamy, and Gendry. We're aware of the plight of the peasantry through the thoughts of point of view characters, but they're never really seen. This was always going to be harder in the show because we can't hear what people are thinking. Introducing Roz early on gives us a commoner as a character. Even better, it gives us a sex worker commoner. Someone basically at the very bottom of the power structure. Women have less power than men in Westeros, which is totally crazy fantasy. That's weird. And women who sell sex have less power than most women. They are entirely dependent upon the taste of men and their ability to entice them to part with their money. The show didn't always use her all that well, but she was there if they had been a bit more competent, and the logic behind her creation is sound and a good and defensible piece of adaptation. Regardless of the motives, all of these were well done changes. They serve a narrative purpose beyond expediency. The reason for many changes going forward in the show seemed to be, well, that was too hard. But the vast majority of early changes served the story or a character or the process of adaptation itself. There's only one other major change in the first episode that we're going to look at, and it's worth examining because it's the first in a painfully long line of significant changes to important characters. When Catelyn is told that Lysa believes the Lannisters murdered Jon Arryn, there is a huge difference between the book and the show that makes show Catelyn a different person with a different role than book Catelyn. It's one of those seemingly small changes that has a massive effect on a character's entire arc, and it's the first example of the things I'll go over in granular detail in a future episode. In the show, Catelyn is a loving mother and wife with seemingly no bad sides other than understandably not liking Jon Snow. I mean, if my wife brought home her affair baby and made it live in the next room, I would be salty too. Can't really hold that against her too much, can we? When Maester Luwin brings Lysa's message in the show, Catelyn begs Ned not to go south, and Ned is in the position of having to refuse her for the sake of honor. For those who haven't read the books, this is precisely opposite of what happens in the books. In the novels, Ned wants to say no. He does not want to leave, he doesn't think he's up to it, and he remembers what happened to his family the last time a Stark went to King's Landing. It's Catelyn who convinces him it is his duty to accept Robert's offer, and one of the main reasons she does so is because of the benefit to their house by having Sansa become queen. She also, rightly, points out that Robert Baratheon is not the same man he was, that it is dangerous to refuse a king, and that it's Ned's duty to get to the bottom of Jon Arryn's murder. There's no other way to describe this change than to say it is a complete and total role reversal for Cat and Ned. Book Ned is sentimental and reticent, and Cat is duty-bound and ambitious. The show switches their motivations. I mean, it literally takes Ned's dialogue from the book and gives it to Cat, and vice versa. It is a strange and jarring difference. This seemingly small change means that when terrible things start happening to Cat in this show, they are through no fault of her own. She is basically a blameless victim. In the books, she's one of the people most principally responsible for the war. She argued for and eventually convinced Ned to go south. She convinced Ned to marry Sansa to Joffrey. She pushes Ned to solve the murder. She's the one who takes Tyrion captive. So Ned's death, as well as the entire war, are at least partially the result of her own actions that flow out of her devotion to the words of her house: family, duty, honor. And the guilt and pain she experiences as she grapples with this fact will be the primary lens through which we view Cat's thoughts and behavior going forward. She will constantly be haunted by it. It's basically the entire core of her character. The story of Book Cat is that of someone mainly concerned with doing what is best for her house and not just herself. She deeply loves Ned but pushes him south for the benefit of her children and their house. This is not a small change for Cat's character and robs her of much of her conflict in the seasons to come. She has nothing to forgive herself for now. She has only external conflicts and no internal conflicts. The show eventually tries to clumsily retcon this by giving Cat a scene where she admits to trying to prayer murder Jon, but it's too little, too late, and Cat is never as interesting in the show as she is in the book, despite a ridiculously fucking good performance from actor Michelle Fairley. Seriously, she is like one of the only people from the show who has become my internal image when reading. I love her in the show. So, we've got a very important change here. One so big it could not have been made by accident. What can we attribute this change to? Was it needed to adapt a novel to the screen? Not that I can see, no. Pacing? No, the scene remains almost word for word outside of switching the dialogue between characters. This can only be either change for change's sake or another more disappointing motive. I think it is highly likely that this is a change that was almost certainly of the no respect for our audience variety. The show never wanted to be as morally ambiguous as the books. This will become crystal clear in a future episode when we examine changes to characters like Varys and Tyrion. It is a seemingly small change that has a huge rippling effect on the very nature of Cat's story. Cat is a strong character we identify with, but she is not a hero in the books. She is awful to Jon. She's ambitious, and her ambition and belief in honor and duty are directly responsible for the deaths of those she loves. The show seems to not trust its audience enough to like Cat despite these failings. It's the first example in the show of the writers sanitizing a character to make her more relatable. This little change does make Cat more likable, but it also makes her less interesting. This very thing will be done to a ridiculous degree with Tyrion over the years. Now, it's easy to write off as obvious all the other small changes and adaptations here, but it wouldn't be fair to the people who make the show. Martin's novels are all told from very close third-person point of views. We are inside the heads of some of the most important characters. This was never going to be possible in the show, which means either hours of on-the-nose dialogue or filling out time with effective character moments that are not in the books. So things like how the Stark family is introduced at the archery butts, or Catelyn and Maester Luwin preparing for Robert, these are critically important and pretty much masterfully done. These are not changes to the text, they are additions that are absolutely needed to turn Martin's point of view structure into a coherent TV show. All of these scenes are remarkably well done. The archery butt scene manages to effectively show us the Starks and the dynamic of the family in just a minute or two. Watching Catelyn plan for visitors shows us who she is and her relationship with Luwin. The show was very good at this to start, and managed to skillfully fill in time with small but important scenes of their own, while keeping the crucial plot moments quite true to the book. The scene where Ned beheads Will, other than not being Garrett and Ned not mentioning Dorne, which we will get to, don't worry. That scene of the beheading is nearly identical to the book because they identified the most important moments to the plot and kept those as similar as was possible. There are changes to Ned and Robert's scene in the crypts, but they are all made to more effectively adapt an internal point of view to a conversation. None of that can be nitpicked, because without these changes, an adaptation is literally impossible. I will never comment on losing internal dialogue. I am only concerned with actual additions or changes. From the start, the show did an admirable job adapting scenes and filling in what we didn't have with small, humble changes. The show began as an adaptation in its truest sense, but there were already the hints of changes being made for strange or no reasons. My intention in this first episode was just to lay out a few examples of changes and try to identify the motives behind them to set the stage for future episodes. Consider this simply a mission statement, a way to make clear that my issues with changes from the books was never that they happened at all, but only that some seemed to be poorly considered. In the next few videos, I'll go into greater detail, and I have used enough of your time for now, I'd say. Next time, we will look at major characters and how even small changes can add up to such huge differences that they no longer serve the same purpose they do in the book. We'll look at how things like eliminating one character robs two others of moments crucial to their story, how even a beloved character like Brienne can become so different that her reason for existence disappears. And then we'll look at plot and where everything else went wrong. Alright, thanks for coming. I know this was a little different. See you next time. Bye.